Hello everyone, it's Shannon here with Waffle Flower Crafts. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to create two really fun cards using the brand new Stitched Harvest stamp set. This is the Stitched Harvest combo. Comes with the Stitched Harvest stamp set in the front and the Stitched Harvest matching dies in the back. This is a layering stamp set, so there are two pumpkins, a pumpkin pie, some leaves, and an acorn all in this set, and each one of these images has different layers to get the different colors to really create a cool cross-stitch look. For layering stamp sets that require more precision when aligning the layers, I have found using the acetate layer that the stamps come on really helpful for getting great alignment. I did cut or trim around the set of stamps that go to create one image. This just makes it easier for me to use this acetate to help me align each layer in this image. I'm going to start this first card by stamping this pumpkin pie slice image. I'm going to start with the very first layer in this image, and I'm just going to center it here on a rather large piece of white cardstock. I want to give a lot of space around this pie because I am going to cut the image out with an embroidery hoops die, so I do need a lot of white space around it. I'm going to start by inking the image up with a Distress Oxide. This is Spiced Marmalade, and I'm going to stamp it onto the white paper. And now I'm going to do a gradation stamping with a darker shade of Distress Oxide. This is Ripe Persimmon, and I'm just going to partially ink the bottom of the stamp, and it will create a nice little gradation on this image, and it'll add a lot of depth to this cross-stitch image. I really like doing this little gradation or inking or stamping to these cross-stitch stamp sets. It adds a lot of depth. And as you can see, I am using a MISTI today. I definitely recommend you using a stamp positioning tool like a MISTI, something with a hinge with these cross-stitch stamp sets. It will make it a lot easier. So now I'm taking the acetate and lining the next layer, which is the top of the pie. I'm lining the acetate up to my previously stamped image. Once I have that aligned, then I'll take the actual stamp and align the stamp to the acetate. I find this is very helpful for getting perfect alignment with these stamps. It's a lot easier to line your stamped up to those black cross-stitch lines on the acetate than trying to just eye that kind of clear stamp with the previously stamped image. I've found this was the most helpful tip I've ever learned for using these layering stamp sets. And just like I did with the bottom portion of the pie, I'm inking the top portion the same. I inked the whole thing up with Spiced Marmalade, then stamped it, and then did some partial inking around the edges of the stamp with Ripe Persimmon to get that beautiful kind of gradation and adding some more depth to the image. Now I'm aligning the pie crust. Once I get that crust perfectly aligned with the acetate, then I'll grab the stamp and align the stamp again to those little X's printed on the acetate. And then once I get it aligned, I'll fold the MISTI over, pick it up, and I'll ink it up. I'm going to ink it up first with antique linen, then stamp. Then I will ink it up with tea dye, and again I'm going to do some partial inking, so I'm just going to ink up the very edges of the pie crust with this darker shade, and then I'll fold my MISTI over and stamp it, and I'll add just, again, a nice little shadow, little depth to that pie crust. Now I'm going to stamp the cute little smiley face that goes with the pie. I'm just going to line it up here, and then I will pick it up and stamp it in VersaFine Onyx Black. And to finish my stamping for this first card, I'm going to grab my sentiment from the Stitched Harvest stamp set, just center it underneath that pie, and then I will ink it up again with VersaFine Onyx Black. With my stamping done, I now will grab the largest hoop die from the Embroidery Hoops die set, center it around the pie and the sentiment, use a little purple tape to hold it in place, and then I will run it through my die cutting machine. So I have a perfect cut here. I'm going to actually keep the image, of course, but I'm not going to keep the white hoop. I'm going to cut that out of craft paper later. I'm now going to start working on my second card, and I'll put both of these cards together at the end of the video. For the second card, I'm going to stamp the other images from this set, the two pumpkins and the two leaves. I'm going to start with the largest pumpkin and just place it anywhere on this cream piece or cream A2 panel of cardstock. I'm going to ink it up with Wild Honey and then just stamp it. It doesn't really matter where I put this pumpkin really to start with, because I'm going to cover this whole panel with pumpkins and leaves from the Stitched Harvest stamp set. Now I'll do some partial inking with Spiced Marmalade, just that lower portion of the pumpkin, and then stamp it. Now I'm going to use the acetate to line up the next layer of this pumpkin. Now it's important to note, especially with this pumpkin shape, since it looks pretty similar either way I flip the acetate, there's a right side to the acetate to make sure you're on the right side, all you have to do is just look at the words that are printed on the acetate. If you can read them, then you're on the right side. If they're mirrored, then you have your acetate flipped over, and then your stamp won't line up to that flipped over acetate image. So just keep that in mind. So I am now stamping the second layer in right persimmon, and that just adds some nice contrast. And now I'm going to stamp the very top of the pumpkin here, the stem, and I just use the acetate to line that up, and I'm using peeled paint. Just ink that up and stamp it, and then I will use a little bit of walnut stain, just partially inking the very bottom of the stem with that, and that again just adds a nice little contrast to that stem and a little depth. Now I'm going to grab the leaves from the Stitched Harvest stamp set, just kind of plop them down there somewhere in the white space, and then I will do a lot of partial inking to these. So I'm going to ink this only about 2/3 up with this wild honey. I'm going to leave a little corner of the leaf uninked, and then I will stamp them. Then I will grab my orange shade, which is Spiced Marmalade, and ink a little bit of that area that I just previously stamped with the wild honey. So not completely covering it because I still want some of that wild honey visible, but just inking a little bit up with that. And then I'll use my darkest shade, which is Ripe Persimmon, and ink the very tips. Now I still have that third left unink. I'm going to use some peeled paint on that very edge of the leaf where I uninked earlier, just to get a little bit of green, and that creates a really pretty gradation, really pretty fall leaf colors on that leaf. Now I'm just grabbing the stem, and again I'm using that acetate I use it for all the positioning of all the layers. I just find it really helpful. And I'm lining up the stamps to the acetate after I get the acetate lined up, and then just pick up the stamps with my MISTI. And these are just the stems of the leaves. And I'm going to ink these up with walnut stain. Now I'm moving on to stamping the second pumpkin that is included in the Stitched Harvest stamp set. This one's a little bit smaller. It's a little hard to tell right now with the stamp, but once I stamp the image, you'll be able to see. I'm actually going to ink this up the exact same way I inked up the larger pumpkin, stamping it first, the first layer in wild honey, then doing a partial inking of the bottom with Spiced Marmalade, then the second layer will be Ripe Persimmon. I do ink it or stamp it twice in Ripe Persimmon just to make sure it's nice and bold and dark. It really helps to make more contrast. And then the stem is peeled paint, and then some partial inking at the very base of the stem with walnut stain. And so I'm going to just jump ahead here to after I've stamped this whole thing, because it's very repetitive. Just how you saw me stamp those 4 images, those 2 pumpkins and leaves, I stamped them repeatedly over this whole entire panel till I get it completely stamped. I'm now stamping the final leaf here, and now I'm ready to move on to the next step. So now that my stamping is done, I'm going to take the largest die from the Patch Layers die set, just center it here on the panel, and use some purple tape to hold it in place and run it through my die cutting machine. This is just going to add a nice detail to the panel. Basically looks kind of like a blanket stitch, and I think it's very fitting with the cross stitch image. And speaking of fitting, we are going to create our embroidery hoop now. So I cut the hoop 3 times out of craft cardstock, and now I'm going to glue each one of these layers directly on top of each other. This is going to create some depth to the hoop and give it kind of a more realistic look, a really nice dimensional look. And I just place some glue around the images and then just stack each one of the die cuts on top. And now I'll hold it to the camera so you can get a good look. I like using the craft paper, stacking it up this way instead of using craft foam because it's all brown now. It just doesn't look like a different color when you look at the card from the side. So now I'm taking my panels. I have a cream panel, A2 panel, I'm adhering it to an A2 top folding card base of craft paper, and I took my stamped panel that we created with all the pumpkins and adhered that to an A2 top folding card base made from craft paper. And now I'm just adhering the embroidery hoop to the cream panel, as well as popping in that center image with the pumpkin right inside. Now I have a sentiment that is stamped off camera. Again, I used the Stitched Harvest, a sentiment from the Stitched Harvest stamp set, just stamped on some craft foam and trimmed it down, and then added some foam tape to the back of it so it has a little dimension. Now, of course, I have to add a little bit of whipped cream. Pumpkin pie is not complete without some whipped cream, so I'm using some Ranger enamel dots here. This is the or enamel accents, I should say. This is the white, and then I'll take some glitter just some clear glitter and sprinkle it on top, and it will stick to the enamel accents, and it'll just add a nice little sparkle and shine to that whipped cream. I think that's kind of fun little detail. And I'll let that dry, and then these will be done. I'll hold up to the camera so you guys can get a good look at all the details and all that beautiful cross-stitch layering. I really like these cross-stitch sets. I have a lot of fun. I think I'm a true stamper at heart. I just really enjoy stamping, and there was a lot of stamping with these. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and cards. If you want any more info on the products I use, please visit Waffle Flower, and you can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook for more creative ideas. Thanks for watching!